what if I told you that what we're seeing on the world stage isn't just a series of random crises? What if it's all part of a hidden strategy, a secret plan, not just to win a battle, but to bring an entire empire crumbling down from the inside? Well, today, we're diving deep into a pretty provocative theory that says exactly that. So, let's just get right to it. This is the big question. Does Vladimir Putin actually have a long-term grand strategy to take down the United States? Now, that's a huge claim, I know, but it's one that some very serious analysts are looking at. The idea is there a deliberate, patient plan that's already in motion? And the guy behind this whole theory is Professor Jiang Xueqin, and his answer is a straight-up yes. He argues that not only does this plan exist, but we are literally watching it play out right now, in the headlines we see every single day. Okay, so how on earth would a plan like that even work? Well, Professor Jiang says that throughout all of history, empires tend to die in the exact same way. They all have the same 3 fatal weaknesses, the same 3 Achilles heels. And if you know what they are, well, you basically have a user's manual for destruction. And this right here, this is the playbook. Number 1 is overextension. You know, it's that imperial hubris where you think you can fight everywhere all at once. Number 2, crippling debt. This is where your greatest strength, the power to print money, suddenly becomes your biggest vulnerability. And number 3, this one's maybe the most important, civil dissent. This is when the stories, the myths that hold a nation together just stop working. To really let that second point sink in, just look at this number. $35 trillion. That's the U.S. national debt. I mean, it's a mind-boggling figure. And Professor Jiang says this is a massive vulnerability, especially now with the BRICS Plus countries building up their own financial system that could, one day, seriously challenge the US dollar. And here's that third point, the failing myths in action. Professor Jiang points to things like the huge university protest over the war in Gaza. He says this is proof that the old story of America as the ultimate good guy is falling apart for a whole new generation. And that internal division, that's rocket fuel for an empire's decline. Okay, so if those are the fundamental weak spots of an empire, how is Putin supposedly taking advantage of them? Well, according to Professor Jiang's theory, the strategy isn't some big direct attack. No, it's way more subtle. It's about applying slow, steady pressure to those exact 3 pillars until they start to buckle. And from this perspective, the war in Ukraine is a strategic masterpiece for Russia. The goal isn't necessarily a quick victory parade in Kyiv. The goal is to turn Ukraine into a giant black hole that just sucks in American money, weapons, and focus year after year. It drives up U.S. debt, it creates bitter political fights back home about all the spending, and it shows the world just how stretched thin the American military really is. And then, as if on cue, the conflict in Gaza ignites. Within this framework, this is just perfect for Putin's goals. It damages America's moral standing on the world stage, it forces Washington to spread its resources even thinner, and it carries the constant threat of blowing up into a much bigger regional war that the U.S. would get dragged right into. Okay, I get it. This all sounds incredibly complicated, maybe a little too much like a conspiracy theory. I mean, has any leader ever actually pulled off this kind of long game, turning what looks like a terrible situation into a massive victory through sheer strategy? And this is where Professor Jiang's theory gets really wild and honestly pretty controversial. He says to understand Putin, we have to look back at Joseph Stalin and World War II, but not as the story of a terrible mistake, but as a masterclass in strategic genius. You know the story we've all been told, right? Stalin was naive. He made a pact with Hitler and actually trusted him. He got rid of his best generals, and then he was completely blindsided when the Nazis invaded in Operation Barbarossa. It's held up as one of the biggest strategic blunders in modern history. But Professor Jiang flips that entire script. He says, what if being invaded and what if nearly losing the war wasn't a mistake at all? What if it was the only possible move on the board that could turn the Soviet Union into a global superpower? And this table right here brilliantly lays out the logic. Just think about it from Stalin's perspective. Scenario A. He attacks Germany first and wins. Well, now the whole world, including the US and Britain, unites against the Soviet aggressors. That's a loss. Scenario B. He attacks and fails. Now he's fighting a war on 2 fronts. He'd likely lose. C. Germany attacks and is stopped right at the border. That's just a long, bloody stalemate. But look at Scenario D.
the one that actually happened. Germany attacks and almost wins. Now the West has to help the USSR. They have no choice. Otherwise, Germany controls all of Eurasia, and it's game over for everybody. It was the only path to a win.
So by losing so badly at first, think about what Stalin actually gained. The invasion united the entire nation in what they still called the Great Patriotic War. It triggered something called Lend-Lease, which was basically over $200 billion in today's money in U.S. aid. America basically industrialized the Soviet Union for free. It was the move that turned a terrible hand into the very thing that made the USSR a global superpower. Now, I know this kind of counterintuitive. 4D chess is really hard for us to wrap our heads around. And to even begin to understand it, Professor Jiang says we need to explore a concept he calls the Russian strategic imagination. It's a completely different way of thinking. He says it has 3 key ingredients. First is intuition, an almost mystical sense for the spirit of the times, for which way the historical winds are blowing. Second is imagination, the ability to see how your actions today can shape a totally different future. And then there's the third one, the weirdest one, embodying multiple personalities. This means being able to convincingly become whatever your opponent needs you to be. For Stalin's plan to work, he had to play the part of a naive, trusting fool so perfectly that he could lure Hitler into the trap. Now, contrast that with what Professor Jiang calls Western thinking. He argues it's narrow, not broad. It's empirical. It only trusts what it can see, what it can measure, the hard data. And it's logical, moving in a straight line from step A to B to C. It's a way of thinking that is absolutely perfect for building efficient, stable bureaucracies. And Professor Jiang has a fantastic phrase for this. He calls it the bureaucratization of the imagination. It's a system that's all about process, rules, and evidence. It values the spreadsheet over the leap of faith. And, he argues, it's a system that is just not built to produce or even to recognize a strategic mind like Stalin's. Or maybe like Putin's. So, when you boil it all down, this theory frames the entire global power struggle not just as a fight over land or oil, but as a fundamental clash between 2 completely different ways of thinking. The logical, process-driven bureaucrat on one side, and the intuitive, imaginative prophet on the other. And that leaves us with the final, really unsettling question that Professor Jiang Xueqin's analysis puts on the table. If you think you're playing a logical game of chess, but your opponent is playing a completely different game, one with rules you don't even recognize, how can you possibly hope to win?